We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on SDG.VISION. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organisations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action.
Well, welcome to the SDG Vision podcast, and a very warm welcome to Penny Melville-Brown. Hello, Penny.
Hello, Pierre.
Lovely that you can join us. We really appreciate it. Now, we got to know about you through watching a film, and it was by the World Association for Sustainable Development, and it featured you giving a talk. It was called Disability, the Threat to Both Sustainability and Women. And the title grabbed us straight off because obviously we're engaged with the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainability is important to us. And women obviously play a very important role in terms of sustainability in the SDGs. So we watched it and we thought, this is terrific. It's going on the channel. And we thought what would be even better would be to have a chat with you to sort of get a bit deeper into what you do, your backstory, your life. So the moment has arrived and we're really pleased that you can join us. Penny, perhaps the place to start would be to give us an overview of who you are.
Well, your fanfare was amazing. Thank you so much for it. Quite muted, I think. My background is I was a naval officer for over 20 years. And I had a great career in the Navy. I was the first woman barrister and I became one of 8 women commanders. And that was, some time ago. And just as I was getting to that sort of stage, my eyesight started to fail. So actually I was probably the first officer in uniform trotting around Portsmouth Naval Base with a white cane forever, probably, especially as a woman. So I had all sorts of difficulties trying to find work because work meant income meant paying the mortgage meant keeping my home. So it was really important. And as I faced all these problems, I realized that there must be, thousands, millions of other people in a very similar situation. So I dedicated the rest of my working life to helping other people with disabilities to fulfill their own potential. I was hugely lucky because the Royal Navy had given me a gift unwittingly, because of course they're not subject to the legislation in this country about equality employment in the military. But they'd kept me on for 2 more years when I really couldn't see very much at all. So as I said, I was medically discharged. I was certified blind and I am totally blind. And I spent the next nearly 30 years working in the disability field, working in government departments, on government boards, in the business sector, in the charitable sector. I set up my own business and I ran lots of projects, actually positively supporting other people with disabilities to get back to work. And that was fabulous. And that came to an end a few years ago because life just moves on. So what I've been trying to do since then is share what I have learned over all those years with other people.
Penny, I just wondered, how old were you when you lost your sight?
Pierre, what a grossly unfair question to ask a lady. Actually, I was in probably middle age, early 40s, even if I may not even have been 40. And that's a really typical time for lots of people to start acquiring disabilities. And that's the only reason I'm being kind enough to tell you your.
Well, sorry to be so inappropriate, but I think it is interesting because I sort of wondered how that transition from obviously your career, and you said that you continued working, but obviously there came a point where it was not possible. And then you mentioned that you were involved in other work with charities in the disability sector. And I wondered what that transition was like. Was it difficult, easy, challenging?
It wasn't. I was hugely motivated, as I said, because I needed to earn money to pay the mortgage to keep my home. So bags of motivation. And I had, as you can probably tell, unspeakable self-confidence. And that was entirely, I believe, to the Royal Navy enabling me to carry on working for several years as my eyesight deteriorated. And so by the end of that, nothing was going to hold me back.
I can well imagine. And to add to your various jobs and your work activity, you've recently become an author as well. And you've published a book called It Could Be You. What's it about, Penny? And most importantly, why should people read it?
Well, it's actually my second book. And we can come back to the other one later if you wish. But It Could Be You is really about those nearly 30 years of experience. Anyway, getting my age now. You can do the sums. And I wanted to share that with other people. And it's not awfully sad, woe is me, I've got a disability and all that rhubarb. This is much more about how important people with disabilities are in their countries, in their economies, in the whole concept of sustainability in the very widest sense, and how we can try and tackle that together. So I have written it for people in government. I've written it for people who are facing real big life difficulties with their health. I've written it for people who are supporting them. And I wanted them to hear it, dare I say it, from the horse's mouth. But it is full of practical suggestions, practical ideas. And that's not about, how do you boil a kettle when you can't see? Not that sort of stuff at all. It's actually what goes on in your head, how you can cope with psychologically the D word, being a disabled person. That is dire. There's all these labels, all this prejudice, all this really uncomfortable time ahead. I remember when I first used a white cane, and in those days I was using a shorter one which just reached the ground, not a long cane for moving. And that was simply to tell other people that I had a sight impairment. And it's like going out in your community with big flashing lights on your head saying, I am broken, I am hopeless, I need help. And that is so difficult. And I think lots of people underestimate the psychological hit you take when you're faced with a long-term health condition. You're faced with often not very successful medical treatment for all sorts of reasons. And then you're faced with a life afterwards which has completely destroyed your sense of self, your purpose in life, your ambition. And I think self-worth, self-purpose is just so fundamental. The key thing that everybody asks each other when we first met, what do you do? Well, actually, if I just sit at home and don't do anything much, but I watch the television or listen to the radio, already that admission of what is no longer possible for you is so crushing. So for me, I'm trying to show other people that there is life out there, but also I want to show employers that just because I can't see doesn't mean I can't do a better job than loads of people. And I want to show government that if you do not enable 1 in 4 of the population, of the working age population, to fulfill their potential, to earn money, to support themselves and their families, no economy is really going to survive that, because you're losing all their income, their tax, you're funding them through benefits, they've got a pension problem when they get older, and you're expecting the other 3/4 of the population to carry that. It's just not realistic. So I'm coming at it from all those different perspectives. And I'll shut up now because I expect you wanted me to catch my breath.
Well, it would be nice if you could catch your breath. We need you to have breath, so that would be very useful. It's a startling statistic, isn't it? 1 in 4. I read that. I read bits of your book, and I read that, and of course, disability. I mean, obviously, your disability is lack of sight, but disability covers a wide range of issues, doesn't it? And most people, when you say disability, think of people who don't have sight, or people who don't have hearing, etc. But it's wider than that, isn't it?
Enormously much wider. You're right. And don't forget wheelchair users. Here in the UK, that's a really classic symbol of disability for all the accessible parking bays and things like that. But the vast majority of disabilities, of long-term, life-changing health conditions, are hidden. You would meet people in the street, you meet people every day, and you are not realizing 1 in 4, and that's just of the working age population here in the UK. It's even higher post-retirement. So, and those figures I'm using are from the 2021 census in the UK. They will not be wildly different elsewhere in the world. Definitions of disability change all over the place. But in broad terms, you're looking at a very, very significant group in the population. And all of us have talents, abilities that we want to bring to our communities, to our nations, to the rest of the world. And yet we are being often constrained in doing that because other people probably feel safer being kind to us and caring for us than taking a risk with us, because I think they see us as a risk, especially if you're an employer. Actually, with a bit of the right help, and it doesn't need to cost much at all, if anything, we can do great things.
I think that's a really interesting comment about, people feel better being caring rather than giving people opportunities and taking that risk, as you say. And for me, what you're saying is about sustainability. If 1 in 4, and as you say, that's a working population statistic, if 1 in 4 have a disability and a large percentage of them are unemployed, then that is not good for the society and it's not good for the individual. So how did, becoming blind, how did it reshape your understanding of what sustainability is and what development, whether it's social development or economic development?
Well, I think what I realized as I lost my sight, and this is a really shocking thing, particularly for young people, is that we're not invulnerable. And as people, we're going to hit downs as well as ups in life. And I think lots of young people, I think early 40s is still young. Lots of young people still think they're going to, rule the world and leap tall buildings and all the rest of it. And suddenly you realize you're not invulnerable. You do have things to face in life. And as you see that, you realize that it's not just you. There's lots of other people who are going to face these sorts of problems. And then you start looking broader afield and you're thinking, actually, the structure, the social structure that we have built up as human beings in this world is at risk. It does face downs. We have to be careful with ourselves, with our environment, with our economies, with our aspirations, because there is a finite amount of, I'm going to say stuff, but it is as broad as that, that we have in terms of resources to keep us all going, whether it's me in my home, whether it's, this country, whether it's the world. So I think when, the typical teenagers who do mad things because they're never going to get hurt, eventually people start realizing we have to take more care of ourselves and the world around us if we're all going to survive, and survive happily and not in misery.
Yes, and of course, one of a form of disability is mental health, and talking about young people, and at the moment there is quite a spike in terms of incidence of mental health as well. So sustainability and development to you, it's about inclusivity by the sounds of it, and that we're stronger if people are given opportunities, even though we may not think they're up to it.
Well, forgive me for saying this, Pierre. Your assessment of whether I'm up to something is probably ill-informed, driven by prejudice, discrimination, and very little knowledge. And forgive me for being so pointed to you. But that actually is typical, isn't it? People think we're not up to it. They're wrong. Lots of people have got loads of capabilities. I worked with people in Derbyshire in the north of England, and I was working with people who'd been out of work with a long-term, life-changing health condition for 10, 20 years. And they were still ambitious. They still wanted to get back to work. They still wanted to put food on the table of their families. They still wanted to be people in their own right with their own aspirations. And all of that is possible. And that's what I was trying to describe in this book, which I've tried to share with politicians and others, because when you are creating new approaches to the economy, to employment, to self-employment, you cannot afford to go into it with assumptions about whether people are up to it or not. Give them the opportunity, let them prove it to themselves as the first step.
Absolutely. I was using a devil's advocate.
You were.
I said it, Penny. I was slightly alarmed when I seemed to think you were taking me literally. But no, I completely agree. And I think that's what sustainability is about, is that we all have gifts, we all have talents. Yes, some people have barriers that prevent them from easily accessing and showing those talents, but my goodness, the world is in such a state at the moment that we need to not only look after our natural resources, well, actually, our natural resources include people. And yeah, so I think that's a really useful inclusion. I think the Sustainable Development Goals, perhaps, I mean, there is, one of the Sustainable Development Goals is good health and well-being. I think it's number 3. That's good, but it doesn't actually state what that means, and what you've been articulating is a far richer appreciation of what it means to stay in good health and your well-being, to be cared for and improved.
Yes, we all, as we mature, we all aim to stay in good health. But actually, some of us do not have any choice. And part of that is where we are in life. And if you look, and again, I'm using UK figures, but they're not going to be hugely different internationally. But if you come from a poorer background, you're born, you don't have a disability, you progress through life. As you get to, in our country, 16-year-old, you're taking your GCSEs, which are your critical examinations at school, which are going to really shape your future. If you're from a poorer background, you're probably, you can be up to 16 months behind the rich kids. That means your chances of doing comparably well in those key exams is, it's gone. So what happens then? You travel on through life. You may give up on education at that stage. You may do a bit more. But your employment chances are going to be so much lower. So you may be going into the low-level jobs, the middle-level jobs. And then come your early 40s, and that's why I was allowing you to pursue my age. Come your early 40s, your chances of being a disabled person is 1 in 4. And that is staggering stuff, because when you compare it with the richer people, they're not reaching that level of risk, 1 in 4 risk, until they're in their 70s. That is 30 years of potentially not earning money, potentially not contributing taxes, potentially relying on benefits, potentially having less pension. And then you can see the cycle continuing, because you've now created 1 in 4 in this this population who are actually going to be even poorer. So you've got this cycle of poverty going on, and following that a cycle of disability coming through. And until we can start tackling that at a strategic policy level, we're really not going to make a huge amount of difference. We can stick bandages on people. You can give me a white cane. But until we resolve it strategically, we're not going to make the big economic, environmental, sustainable changes that we need to do. And can you hear me? I'm on my soapbox.
It's a soapbox that's very well made, very well constructed, Penny. And I think that, however, there's one thing that I think we need to clarify from what you said is, why are poor people from a poorer background economically, why are they more likely to become disabled in their 40s?
I think there's a whole range of things going on. There's just nutrition. There's perhaps jobs that are higher risk, perhaps a lifestyle that's at higher risk, perhaps home environments that are riskier. If you're in a poorer home, perhaps perhaps there's only one parent. Perhaps they're struggling to get food on the table. Perhaps they're working all hours they have. Perhaps there's all sorts of factors that are much more complicated than I suspect I can ever attempt to tackle or even understand. But I have real faith that just being poor, just being disabled, doesn't mean you don't have a sense of self-worth, self-ambition, purpose in life. Everybody wants that. I can hear people sort of sneering and saying, oh, well, they all prefer living on benefits. I don't believe that's the case. I think when you've been told by your last employer, your GP, the benefit system, all sorts of other people in authority that you're not fit for work, it's completely understandable that you believe them. And to keep on with that drive and ambition in the face of that is hugely difficult. And I don't blame people who don't survive it, because it's like mass brainwashing.
As you say, it's easier for the state, or whether it's a GP surgery or wherever, to say, yeah, well, you're disabled, so you don't have to work, rather than create pathways for people to take that first step, because often that first step is the most difficult.
I want you to think about that lifeline that I was describing to you, and what people were doing by the time they were 40s. Most of them will have been in work. And so part of the issue is, why did they lose their jobs? And there will be all sorts of things to do with that. Partly it will be, it was a very long health problem and their employer could no longer support them. Or perhaps their employer wasn't able to make the reasonable adjustments they needed. All sorts of things like that. Actually, we should be thinking, did the system support them up to the point of this life-changing health condition? Or had the system abandoned them? And I'm not going to be precise about which bit of the system, because it could be all bits or one bit, and let them drop out of employment and that sense of self-worth, that sense of financial independence. Or was it the person themselves? And I think you would often find that the approach to people receiving a life-changing condition at that sort of middle age in their lives is just so devastating, yet the system is not capable at the moment. And I'm not meaning that in a horrid way. I'm trying to say that it isn't joined up enough. There isn't policy knitting across all the sectors together that makes it possible for those people to carry on or to find a different way of surviving and succeeding throughout the rest of their lives. And for me, part of this, and this isn't any political party, but I think there's been far too much silo thinking, not enough, I'm going to say that awful phrase, joined up government, but where people are working across government and saying, actually, these are the bits that we can do, we can influence. If we bring them all together, we can capture those people before they have a disaster and help them move on. And I think all of that is possible. I think in the short term, it's probably not cheap. In the longer term, which regrettably no government really wants to hear, it should make savings, because you start sorting out some of the pension problems in the long term. You start looking at some of the other related problems, the benefits and the lost income. But there are other health problems that are going to arise as well. Disabled men have the highest risk of suicide of any group because of their disability. Women, we know, if they're disabled, they have much higher risk of sexual, physical, coercive violence. So those are all more critical costs to society. And it's not just the financial costs, but it's the emotional, the stability costs for a society as a whole.
Yeah, and I think it's the joined up thinking, absolutely. And I think that's what the Sustainable Development Goals do very well, that they they prove that actually one issue is not an issue that stands on its own. It's affected by other issues. And if you take those issues into account, then you have a chance of actually solving that one problem. I guess one of the problems is, you mentioned that you've worked with politicians.
No, not. I worked with government, in government, not in government. My exposure to politicians has been very small.
Okay. But how do you think, it was really interesting you saying that actually in the short term, it may be expensive to ensure that people with disabilities can lead meaningful lives and meaningful employment, continue their employment, etc. In the long term, it will save money. We exist within a political system where there are 5-year terms or 4 or 5-year terms for political parties, and they don't think about the long term necessarily because they may not be in power by the time that those benefits have accrued. I wonder, do you think there's a way around that at all? Because that's sometimes if you've worked in government, you know that it's political cycles that often inform debate and policies. What do you think about that, Penny? Are we snookered by that?
I think. Do you remember we were talking about 1 in 4, and that's working age people, and even higher amongst people in retirement. That's a fairly significant portion of the population. And if you're a government that's looking for, or a political party that's looking for election, I think you might be foolish to ignore such a substantial portion of the electorate. So that's one response. I think 2, people are already rumbling about parts of the problems that I've been talking about whether the NHS in the UK is actually being effective enough in delivering healthcare, whether employment opportunities are actually realistic, and we've started to put more careers support into job centres. Whether actually we've got employers suitably persuaded and encouraged and supported to retain and actually recruit people with those life-changing conditions. And underneath all of those positives that are there, and there are big positives for employers because disabled workers tend to stay in the job longer, much more loyal, have fewer unplanned health problems. They are actually less risk in lots of ways. But underpinning all of that, we have a thing called the Equality Act 2010. And it's about time the Equalities and Human Rights Commission started making sure it was being properly applied. So there's swings and roundabouts, carrots and sticks. So there are levers that any government could start deploying early on and start making a difference. But they need to take the hearts and minds of people with them. And that's the hearts and minds, attitudes, behaviours of disabled people themselves, the people who support them and care for them, the people who are going to employ them potentially, the people who are actually operating the system, the rest of the general public. And I think until you have a hearts and minds argument that is persuasive, is well based on fact and costs, you're really beginning to beat your head against a brick wall.
Yes, and hearts and minds. That's part of what you do, of course, I think, in terms of talking about disability and talking not about the negatives of disability, but about the positives that people have inside them, and to see them first,
Yes.
because often people see disabled people and think, oh, isn't it a shame? Isn't that awful that they're disabled? And that will be the thing that sticks in their mind. They won't think about, what about their talents?
Can I tell you a story then? Back in 2017, I won a fairly major international prize for blind people with ambition. And I was, I think I was one of 200 entries from 27 countries. And I won, drum roll, $25,000. And I wanted to use that to demonstrate to other people that just because you've got a disability doesn't hold you back. You can do anything. And I thought cooking was a good medium because it's very popular. And so people might actually clue into it. And I've always done cooking. And then I realized I really needed to be not just cooking at home. So I decided I'd travel around the world cooking, which I did. 6 continents, blah, 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 months and months of doing it. And in lots of places, I was cooking in professional kitchens and in home kitchens. And going into that first kitchen with a professional chef who was terrified. Who is this strange blind woman in my own kitchen, which is my domain? What's she going to do? And he was a very nice man, but he'd offered me utterly boring, trivial things to make. Because obviously, as a blind person, that's all I could manage. And so I did that. And as I chatted to him, he realized that actually I knew what I was talking about. I could do this stuff. I could do it, dare I say it, blindfold, which is more than he could have done. And so actually, I then graduated onto choux biscuits, which are those very difficult French biscuits to make. And I succeeded. They're you put them over a rolling pin to give them their shape. And by the end of it, we were just chatting away as one person who enjoyed cooking to another one. And I think I didn't blame him at all for his fear. And for him, it was fear of the unknown. And I understood that. And we have to acknowledge that when I'm banging on about politicians and employers and government officials and all the rest of it, they do not have that knowledge, experience, familiarity. They are still moulded often, and without it being their fault, on the negative side of things, and not seeing this real person shining through.
Absolutely, and we could see that very well today, Penny. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that a lot of the barriers between people, and you were talking about hearts and minds,
yes,
and winning hearts and minds.
Yes,
people often feel afraid of perhaps saying the wrong thing to someone with a disability, or
Yes, they do.
And I'm thinking particularly young people, because hearts and minds is important to win them at a young age.
Yes.
And when you mentioned young people before, how do you think? What would you say to young people if they say, well, there is a disabled person that I know, but I haven't really had a conversation because I don't really want to upset them or insult them because I don't really know how to talk to them? What would you say?
Well, the first thing is, a disabled person. I bet you know a lot more than that one, because young people will often be just seeing, the obvious ones, the one with the white cane, the dog, the wheelchair, blah, blah, blah. So they will know lots more disabled people. And so the first thing is just throw out that word, disability, disabled. I know lots of people. Some of them have had life-changing health conditions, but they're still people. They still have lots of experiences, lots of knowledge, lots of fun, lots of naughtiness to share. They're interesting people in their own right. Get rid of that label, that barrier of disability. Just ignore it, put it aside. And perhaps as a young person, you can be a bit helpful. And that's always nice because that makes you feel even more important and in charge of life. So go out and find people who've got those life-changing health conditions. Find out how they're surviving, because they might have some tricks that might help you in the long term too.
Well, that's very true. And also stop being fearful, I suppose, is and stop worrying about making mistakes.
Yes, because I don't worry about making mistakes.
No, I've gathered that already, Penny. and that's a shining example, because look at where, what you've done, what you've achieved. And a lot of that is, as you said, you're a self-confident person, but that self-confidence is not won overnight necessarily.
No.
And fear of making mistakes. Well, if you don't make mistakes, you don't learn. Obviously there are tragic mistakes that one should avoid. But for young people, it is that. Just engage and treat disabled people as people, not disabled people.
And learning how to interact with people with a completely different life experience to your own. Because when you're looking for, to further your education, looking to find a job, go to university, whatever you want to do in life, having that breadth of brain power, of experience, of understanding of other people is invaluable. Because, we read stories when we're young, we watch films, there will still be disabled people in them. And if you can start understanding that 1 in 4 of the people around you is going to be in that position, and it could be your boss, it could be your school teacher, it could be your lecturer, it could even be the person you fancy, why would you let that be a barrier? Because I suppose in a way, it just gives disabled people more power over us, because we can make you afraid. Be very afraid.
Well, it's not disabled people making people afraid. It's people themselves making themselves afraid by thinking they're going to make a mistake. So I'm going to take that superpower away from you because it's not true. You don't make anyone afraid, at all, Penny. So I was going to ask, what one thing that everyday people, listeners of this podcast, could do to advance the lives of people living with disability in their community. And I wonder, have you answered that question already, perhaps? Would that be the one thing that you say? Just to engage?
Yes, engage, be kind. The biggest problem, I did lots and lots of training around disability. And when you talk to people, their first reaction is lifts and ramps. Have you got Braille in the lift? Do you know how many people in the UK regularly use Braille?
Well, I read in your book, interestingly, that as people who have poor eyesight, the older that you get, is more difficult to make out the Braille. Is that right? It's the raised, yeah. So not as high as I would think then.
About 20,000. So there's your lift. Well, that's a Braille in the lift. Lifts and ramps, ignore those. What's much more important that makes the world go round is our attitudes towards each other and our behaviour towards each other. So if we are kind, thoughtful, compassionate, supportive, understanding, those are words that you would apply to a good relationship with anyone, aren't they? Yes?
Absolutely.
And then from those words becomes your behaviour. So you start putting those attitudes into action. And so what you're really doing is treating us as you would like to be treated by other people. And that's a real, simplistic, very hackneyed phrase, but just be kind. Think about your attitude to other people. Why would you change it just because I've got a white cane?
And I think that it doesn't necessarily just restrict itself, that consciousness, that way of thinking, to people. I think if we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals,
Yes,
it means that people have to start thinking broader and look at the connections between them and the people and the animals and the wildlife, the environment in which they live, and to take more interest in that, and to be more curious, because, as you said, that people sometimes have very fixed views, and that's lack of curiosity, lack of finding out. And I think for the Sustainable Development Goals, it requires people to think a little bit more deeply about their connection to other things.
I would say that there's another aspect to this, and that is about understanding risk. And I talked earlier on about young people who tend to have very little idea about risk. And I think people need to understand the risks that we create for ourselves, in how we live, in how we behave towards each other, of what we do, to our whole environment. And that can be your working environment, it can be a bit of nature down the back garden, it can be the whole of the world. But if we do not start being much more conscious of the risks to ourselves and the risks that we impose and impact outside our individual lives, we are not really going to succeed very well. And actually, most of life is about deciding what risks I'm going to take, what can I afford to take, how serious will the impact be. And I need young people to think about that. So they can come up to me and ignore me, but they risk me being a lot more influential in their lives than they realise. Have I said that with narrowed eyes?
Yeah, very much so.
But I'm just looking at it generally. You can't afford to take the risk of upsetting people about whom you really know nothing other than the fact they've got a guide dog or a wheelchair. They may be much more important, much more influential, much more helpful in your life than you realise. Because actually, of course, we can help them too.
Yes, and it comes back to making mistakes, but as long as it's done with a respectful attitude.
What, my attitude to them or theirs to me?
Them to people, young people to people with disabilities.
And people with disabilities back.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, yes. I mean, that's an important point, isn't it? The opening up has to be both ways, really, for it to be successful. Penny, it's been fascinating. It would be very remiss of me not to ask you where people can find your book. It could be you. How can they buy it?
Well, I think you can buy it anywhere in the world from Amazon. And so there's a paperback version, which is hardly, so cheap you wouldn't even notice it. And there's an even better one on Kindle, which will be more accessible for some people. So, and this isn't about me making lots of money. This is about just trying to change some minds out there. And I hope it works.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I need to mention is that wonderful series of yours, Baking Blind.
Oh, yes.
Tell us where people can see that.
Well, my previous book was the story of my worldwide cooking adventures and how I nearly died in a road traffic accident. I was in hospital for 5 months after that and recovered. Well, it's taken years. And so that is also available on Amazon as a cook's tour, Baking Blind Goes Global. But if you go to my website, which is pennymelville-brown.com, there's a recipe section there, and you can look at a recipe, and lots of them have got links to my YouTube channel, which is me actually cooking those recipes in different places around the world. And also there's quite a lot of audio recipes there, obviously along with the letters, the typed out ones. But the audio ones, I've been doing those for our National Talking News Federation. So that's one visually impaired person to other people who have problems with print, telling them how to make a real mess of their kitchens too.
And I think fun is really important, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Fun is absolutely essential, that we should all have fun, learn more about each other, and make use of the wonderful gifts and resources that everybody has on this planet.
Yes.
Penny, on that note, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us.
And thank you, Pierre. It's been really fun.
Great. That's terrific. Bye-bye now.